Welcome to yet another very topical and very timely EMET webinar. This is the 27th webinar that we've held since the pandemic broke out, and most of us have been voluntarily quarantined. And it's one that I have been looking forward to with great relish. Because Doug Feith is not only a brilliant analyst, and he took part in part of the history that we're going to discuss firsthand, but he's been a long-time wonderful friend. Doug is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he heads the Center for National Security Strategies. He's the author of the New York Times bestselling memoir, War and Decision Inside the Pentagon at the Dawn of the War on Terrorism. He was a professor of national security studies at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. He was a distinguished visiting fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution and a visiting scholar at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. As Undersecretary of Defense for Policy under Don Rumsfeld from July 21st through August 2005. He helped devise the U.S. government strategy for the war on terrorism and contributed to policy making for the Afghanistan and Iraqi campaigns. This is particularly interesting now as we're heading into the next election season because Doug's very incisive work, the Trump peace plan, aiming not to make a deal, but to make the deal possible, as a cautionary tale of the pitfalls that various administrations have gone, have fallen into, going very far back into the early days of the Oslo Accords up on through the Trump plan. He, of course, wrote this book together with Scooter or Louis Libby, and it was produced by the Bessa Center. And I would really encourage all of our viewers today to read the plan, because no matter what happens, whether or not it's implemented at all, and it at this point does not look like it will be, but whether or not, I think that this analysis is extremely important to have on hand, because it seems like there is a pattern of going from one extreme to another. There seems to be a pattern that Doug described perfectly of how one administration sets out to correct what they perceive of as the biases of the last one. So my first question to you, Doug, is you state that the Trump plan receives scant serious attention, but a great deal of criticism. Why do you think that is?
First of all, it's nice to be with you, Sarah, and I appreciate the work that EMET does, and so I'm happy to participate in this webinar. The Trump peace plan was worked on, developed over 3 years or so, and it was finally published at the end of January of 2020. And as we note in our analysis, that was a strange time for the United States, Israel, and the world, because it was just as the Chinese epidemic was becoming the global pandemic. It was also just before the Israeli third election within a year, to where the Israelis were floundering and having enormous difficulty, unprecedented difficulty in putting together a government. And so the Israelis were distracted by their own political issues. The world became distracted with COVID-19, and the peace plan was launched, but didn't get anywhere near the attention it might have gotten under different circumstances. It was immediately criticized very strongly for obvious reasons, and that is the Trump peace plan unabashedly took a hammer to the conventional wisdom about Arab-Israeli peacemaking. Its main points were that the Palestinian Authority was disastrously organized, corrupt, non-functioning. It was extremely harsh in its criticisms of the Palestinian Authority and their attitudes toward Israel, toward peace, and for that matter, their attitudes were terrible toward toward the rights of their own people. It took an extremely strong position supporting Israeli security concerns. And so it was viewed from the beginning as strongly unbalanced in favor of Israel. And so it got criticism from lots of people for that reason. And it basically made clear that there's no prospect for Arab-Israeli peace unless and until the Palestinians do radical political reforms and change both their institutions and their leadership.
You mentioned in your paper that there are 4 particularly notable elements within the plan. Can you briefly describe each of these elements and how it diverges from the others?
Yes, and I will, if you'll permit my sideward glance here, I will.
Okay, sure.
Myself of the 4 as we listed them here. The first notable element is what I just said, that peace is possible only if the Palestinians do major political reforms and implicitly have a new political leadership. The second notable element, which is in the history of US Middle East diplomacy, something that the Trump administration can say is an innovation, is a warning. And that warning is to the Palestinians. And it says to the Palestinians that if they don't drop their practice of terrorism and their rejection of Israel, their cause will suffer. Now, US policy since 1967 has focused on trying to preserve the legal status quo of the territories. And most American administrations have pushed Israel to try to return to something like the pre-1967 lines, with some variations. Most US administrations have upheld the idea that Resolution 242 requires some adjustments to the boundaries, but basically some kind of return to a map that, with some variations, would look like the pre-1967 map. The Trump administration takes a different position, and this is really a radical departure. This is the second major element of their plan. It takes a radical departure, and it says to the Palestinians, if you do not change your positions toward Israel and toward terrorism, the United States is not going to pressure Israel to preserve the pre-67 status quo. And it says to the Palestinians, over time, you're going to lose ground. And the Israelis are going to improve their position with American support. And the Trump peace plan, and this gets to the third major element, The Trump peace plan has what it calls a conceptual map. And that map shows that the areas that the Trump administration believes that Israel would retain in any reasonable peace negotiation with the Palestinians. And it shows that the Israelis would retain the Jordan Valley, and it shows that the Israelis would retain the major settlement blocks. And it basically says that if the Palestinians do not accept the Trump peace plan and do not negotiate reasonably a peace on the basis of that plan, then the United States would support the Israelis in applying their sovereignty, extending their sovereignty to any of the areas that the map published in the plan shows would be Israeli as a result of a reasonable negotiation. So this is basically a green light from the administration for the Israelis to extend their sovereignty not only to the settlement blocks, but also to the Jordan Valley. That's really a radical departure. No US administration before has ever said, here are the areas that the Israelis could unilaterally extend sovereignty to with US support. Now, the fourth notable element of the peace plan is that it says that Israel can dramatically improve its relations with the Arab states even before it concludes peace with the Palestinians. It turns on its head a piece of conventional wisdom from decades, and that is the previous administrations have argued that the only way the Israelis could improve their relations with the Arab states is making a deal with the Palestinians. That gave the Palestinians conceptually a veto over the improvement of Israeli relations with the Arab states. Now, as we know, Israel has managed to substantially improve its relations with the Arab states in recent years, mostly because of the Iran issue. The Arab states are much more concerned about the Iranian danger to them and to Israel's ability and Israel's ability to help the Arab states protect themselves against Iran. They're much more concerned about that than they are concerned about Israeli concessions to the Palestinian Authority, because the Palestinian Authority has lost the respect of the Arab leaders and even to some extent of the Arab publics. And so what this plan does, what the Trump plan does, which is quite remarkable, is it says that the United States will work with Israel to improve Israel's relations with those Arab states, even before there is a peace agreement with the Palestinians. And it says that the progress that Israel makes in improving its relations with the Arab states can then be used to put pressure on the Palestinians to make progress toward peace with Israel. And that really is remarkable because it reverses the order of proceeding that past administrations have had in mind.
Yes, just in terms of that fourth element, many people have argued that Israel's relationship, particularly with Jordan, would be jeopardized if Israel were to extend sovereignty over the Jordan Valley. How would you respond to that?
Well, it's a danger, but in evaluating that danger, I think Israeli and American officials should keep a number of things in mind. Okay. Number one, the warnings that the Arab street will explode if Israel takes actions that benefit its own interests and security, or if the United States supports Israel in taking such actions. Warnings of that kind have been made for decades, and they've been tested over and over again. And it's often the case that those warnings are overstated. And so I think, and also the Trump administration itself, by moving the US embassy to Jerusalem, which many people had predicted would cause an explosion in the Arab street, not only in the West Bank and Gaza, but throughout the Arab world, and no explosion of that kind happened. There's an argument that warnings of that kind in general should be viewed a little more skeptically than we have viewed them in the past. That's one point. Another point about the Jordanian reaction on the Jordan Valley. It's clear that Jordanian officials publicly have wanted to stress warnings against Israel taking this action. They wanted to discourage the Israelis from extending their law to the Jordan Valley. At the same time, there have been some Jordanian leaders off the record and even on the record who have been mentioned in the press as pointing out that Israeli control of the Jordan Valley serves not only Israel's security interests, but Jordan's security interests. And it does so because the Jordan Valley is essentially a buffer between the most populated Palestinian, the areas of the West Bank that are most heavily populated with Palestinians, and Jordan. So the Jordan Valley sits between the more populous Palestinian cities in the West Bank and Jordan. And what that means is if Hamas, for example, were to ever take over the West Bank as it took over Gaza, Israeli control of the Jordan Valley helps insulate Jordan from the dangerous influence of Hamas political power in the Palestinian cities of the West Bank. And that would help protect the Jordanian regime from that kind of radicalism. It also works the other way around. If Jordan itself ever fell to extreme forces, the Israeli control of the Jordan Valley would serve as a buffer between that radical Jordan and the Palestinian controlled areas of the West Bank. And so I think, now, this does not make necessarily an argument that Israel should extend its sovereignty to the Jordan Valley. It's an argument that Israel should retain control of the Jordan Valley. And Israel now has control of the Jordan Valley. The calculations that Israeli leaders have to make is, given the fact that they already have control and they're not under any great pressure to relinquish that control, how much extra value to Israel would Israeli leaders get by extending their sovereignty to the Jordan Valley, and how does that weigh against the political price they might have to pay for doing so? That's a decision that Israeli leaders have to make. And what we've seen is, even though the Trump administration has said in advance that it would support the Israelis extending their sovereignty to the Jordan Valley, Israeli leaders have so far not chosen to do so. And so they have to make this difficult calculation. I'm not suggesting how they should resolve that. They have a really difficult choice to make.
Right. Excellent. The title of your monograph is not to make a deal, but to make a deal possible. And you point out that there are certain societal changes within the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian leadership that would have to be made. As you say, the Trump plan effectively tells the Palestinians that the sensible question is not whether a deal provides everything you're entitled to, but whether it is the best deal available now or in the foreseeable future. and that if the Palestinian demand for, quote, justice includes the destruction of Israel, Trump warns that the US cannot support them. Do you believe in future administrations that people will understand that there are certain societal requirements that are really necessary to make a peace that will endure for generations and not just have another White House signing ceremony on the lawn?
Well, the conventional wisdom of many decades is not going to die easily or all at once.
Yes.
But events have contradicted that conventional wisdom, and the Trump peace plan, for anybody who bothers to read it, makes a very strong case that the old conventional wisdom is not correct. And so the essence of the old conventional wisdom about peacemaking is that the conflict is about a bunch of final status issues. That what the parties are fighting about, the reason there is not peace, is because they haven't resolved boundaries, security arrangements, water rights, the issue of the settlements, Jerusalem, and other specific and discrete issues. Now, decades of effort, at least 30 years of effort since Oslo began, have been, and actually even decades before Oslo, there were efforts along these lines to view the conflict as about these discrete issues and try to resolve these discrete issues through mutual compromise. There is a contrary view, and the contrary view seems to be understood by the people who drafted the Trump peace plan. And the contrary view is the conflict is not about those discrete issues. It's not about boundaries. It's much more fundamental and ideological. The conflict is about deeply rooted nationalistic and religious convictions on the part of the Palestinian leadership that all of Palestine is Arab land, and no compromise on that matter is possible. And so the issue is not how large Israel should be, but whether Israel should be at all, whether there should be a Jewish majority state in what the Arabs consider to be their land at all. Now, if that's the problem, and I think there's a strong historical argument you could make to show that that really is the problem as the Palestinian leadership conceive of it. If that really is the problem, then there cannot be peace unless there's a new Palestinian leadership with different convictions. In other words, that you recognize that the problem is ideological in nature. It's not a matter of resolving a handful of discrete so-called final status issues. And what the Trump plan talks about is there has to be political reform on the Palestinian side that basically could be made only by people who are different from the people who are currently the Palestinian leaders. And they have to be people with different principles and different ideological outlooks. And if you don't have those different people, you're not going to get peace. And you're not going to get peace by trying to negotiate mutual compromise on these standard Oslo process final status issues with the people who are currently running the Palestinian Authority.
Right. Okay. Upon his death, Yitzhak Rabin has his legacy has been used by the left, and there's a great deal of mythology about what he really believed. And while going through the history of what happened at Camp David II during the Clinton Arafat Barak talks, you said that Yitzhak Rabin had certain red lines that he crossed. Can you elaborate on some of Yitzhak Rabin's red lines?
That Yitzhak Rabin had certain red lines that Barak crossed.
That Ehud Barak crossed, right. I'm sorry.
Well, there is a widespread view that is a misconception that Rabin was the champion of the two-state solution. And it's extremely easy to understand why people believe that to be true. And it's a widely held view, even among people who are rather expert in this field, but it's not actually correct. And what Rabin believed, he said in the last major speech that he gave to the Knesset before he was assassinated. He was assassinated in early November 2005. And in early October of 2005, just a month before Rabin died, he gave a major speech to the Knesset about his goals in the Oslo process. And in that speech, he said that his concept of a resolution of the conflict is that the Palestinians would have an entity, which he specifically said was short of a sovereign state, that they would have an entity that would take responsibility for governing their people in the West Bank and in Gaza. And so he specifically said he did not support Palestinian sovereign statehood. And so he was not a champion of the two-state solution. He believed that Palestinian sovereignty would create an unstable situation rather than a stable peace. The other thing he said is there should be permanent Israeli control of the Jordan Valley. And when Barak then became prime minister in 1999 and had the Camp David negotiations with Arafat hosted by Bill Clinton in July of 2000, Barak had already accepted the principle of Palestinian sovereign statehood, which went beyond Rabin's red line. And he also accepted the idea that the Israelis would retain control of the Jordan Valley only for a limited period of time, which ultimately was negotiated to be 6 years. I think it was 6 years. And then in Barak's memoirs, which are absolutely fascinating because they show his cluelessness as a diplomat. I mean, it's a very interesting thing to read. Barak is a very smart guy and indisputably a high IQ person. But even though he was a high IQ person and a great soldier and a great military leader, he was a naif as a statesman and a diplomat. And that comes across in his own memoirs, which I would urge people to read because it's almost impossible to believe it unless you hear it from his own, as it were, from his own pen. And Barak explains that he went to Camp David with his own red lines about Jerusalem and how in the course of talking with Clinton and Arafat at Camp David, Barak violated his own red line. He said the one thing that no Israeli leader could do would be to agree to divide Jerusalem. He then agreed to divide Jerusalem. And he agreed, for example, that the Palestinians would have sovereignty in the old city over the Muslim and Christian quarters. And then he got pressed by Clinton, well, what about the Temple Mount? And he said, well, the one thing that no Israeli leader could possibly conceive of would be relinquishing sovereignty over the Temple Mount. And then he said, even though I believed that, when Clinton pressed me, he said, I agreed to that also. And this is part of the reason that everybody involved on the American side was so impressed by how radical Barak's positions were at Camp David and in the months after, in making offers to Arafat that nobody believed any Israeli leader could possibly make. And despite that, Arafat came back and said there are two things in addition to all of those concessions that he asked for. One was Palestinian sovereignty over at least part of the Western Wall. And then even more significant, Arafat demanded a Palestinian right of return, which Clinton in his memoirs says is tantamount to destroying Israel as a Jewish majority state. And Clinton told Arafat, there's no way that any Israeli leader could agree to having Israel flooded by returning Palestinians, a few of whom would be refugees and millions of whom would be descendants of refugees. And but that's what Arafat insisted on, and that's why the Camp David offer of Barak failed.
So do you think it was that, or do you think it was what's commonly said, that he really didn't want to be a leader? He didn't want to take on the responsibility of executive leadership, but rather, he wanted to just be a rebel and talk about the entire pie. And
well, it's a good point. I mean, when I say that those demands were the reason that Camp David failed, what I'm really saying is Arafat could not bring himself, as a matter of principle,
right,
to accept the permanent existence of a Jewish majority state in Palestine. And so he made demands that he knew would prevent a deal, because he didn't want to, he was okay making limited deals with Israel, as long as they didn't involve violating the principle that someday the Palestinians would be able to liberate, as they see it, their entire land. And what Clinton was pressing Arafat for was a final peace deal. And he got extraordinary concessions from Barak, so extraordinary that it probably caused a bit of a panic with Arafat, because Arafat had made demands that he thought would never be answered, and then Barak basically satisfied those demands. And so Arafat had to continue to up and up the demands until he got to something that Arafat would have to reject. And demanding that Israel accept millions of Palestinians, as returnees, was finally something that was something that even Barak had to say no to. And but the real point is that I think that, and it's, I think some people consider it paradoxical, but Arafat was clearly a liar and a murderer. But he was also sincere in his anti-Zionist principles. And he remained true to his principles of never agreeing that Israel could exist permanently. He remained true to those principles throughout. And so ultimately, the reason that all the negotiations with Arafat failed was that he was willing to do interim and partial agreements, but he was not willing to make a permanent peace with Israel. And what happened at Camp David was the Israeli left's fantasy of a peace offer was fulfilled. And the leaders of the peace movement, people like the writers Amos Oz and Aleph Bet Yehoshua, both wrote articles after the failure of the Camp David talks saying everything that we, the leaders, the inventors of peace now, have ever suggested was put to the test at Camp David. Barak offered everything that we ever advocated. And Arafat made it clear that he was not willing to make peace, even if the peace now agenda was put before him. And so this is part of the reason that the failure of the peace talks in 2000 at Camp David did such damage to the left in Israeli politics. It devastated their position intellectually and politically. And from the year 2000 until now, the left has not recovered politically in Israel.
Right. Do you believe that Mahmoud Abbas's ideology is any different from Arafat's?
Well, that was exactly the question that came to the fore when Arafat died, and Abbas succeeded him in I believe, January of 2005. And there was a view that Condi Rice, as Secretary of State, championed in the second Bush administration, that, okay, Arafat was a horrible guy and Arafat was a disaster and we couldn't make peace with Arafat. But Abbas, even though he was Arafat's number two, Abbas is a different story. And Abbas is actually a moderate Palestinian reformer whom we can do business with. And so major efforts were made by Condi Rice and her State Department, and with some support from President Bush, even though he was a little bit more skeptical, but still he went along with his second term Secretary of State. And major efforts were made to essentially revive the Oslo process. It was called the roadmap, but it was essentially a warmed over Oslo process. Major efforts were made. Bush finally agreed to a big international conference in 2007 at Annapolis, and additional diplomacy was conducted to try to make peace with Abbas. Finally, Ehud Olmert, as Israeli Prime Minister, made an offer that was similar to the offer that Barak had made in 2000, an extremely generous offer, which, even though Condi Rice makes it clear in her memoirs, she really detested Ehud Olmert. But nevertheless, she was pleasantly surprised and even astounded at the generosity of the offer that Abbas made, Olmert made to Abbas in 2008. But like Arafat, Abbas refused to make peace, and again stuck with the position insisting on a right of return that would destroy Israel as a Jewish majority state. And so it turns out that the problem was not the idiosyncratic unreasonableness of Arafat, it was a problem of the Palestinian leadership in general.
What I found most gripping and intriguing about your article was the descriptions of what was going on behind the scenes during the George W. Bush 43 White House, when you were not a minor player, Doug. And you write that Condoleezza Rice had thought that the Gulf Arab leaders would not support Israel vis-a-vis Iran unless we solve the Palestinian-Israeli issue. Could you tell me how this played out and how she changed her mind about this, or whether she did?
Well, the argument that unless the United States squeezes the Israelis, distances itself from Israel, forces the Israelis to make concessions, that unless we do that, our ability to cooperate with the Arab states will be severely limited. That's an argument that has been made since Israel came into being in 1948. And it's a widely held view within the foreign policy establishment, especially at the State Department and the intelligence agencies. At the beginning of the George W. Bush administration, Secretary of State Colin Powell made that argument regarding Iraq. And when the president in the year 2002 began to think of how in the war on terrorism is he going to handle the problem of the Saddam Hussein regime and its threats to the United States and its support for terrorism and its defiance of UN Security Council resolutions, when Bush was wondering, like, what do I do about Iraq? And there were debates within the administration about this. One argument that Secretary of State Colin Powell made repeatedly is you're not going to get the cooperation of any Arab countries on the Iraq issue unless you squeeze the Israelis to make peace in favor of Arafat. And President Bush went along with that and actually made some unprecedented concessions. President George W. Bush was the first American president to make it U.S. policy to support a sovereign Palestinian state. And that was in response to this argument that that Secretary of State Powell had made. Now, later, as you alluded to in your question, Sarah, later, after Saddam was overthrown, Condi Rice became Secretary of State in the second term of the Bush administration, and she argued similarly that we will not get any support from Arab countries against Iran unless the United States puts pressure on Israel. Now, whether Colin Powell had any merit in his argument regarding Iraq, it is absolutely clear that Condi Rice was wrong. In other words, you could debate the question of how important Israel was to Arab support for the United States against Iraq, because we didn't get a lot of Arab support against Iraq. But Condi Rice's argument that the United States would not get a lot of support from the Arab states against Iran unless the United States pressured Israel in favor of the Palestinians is obviously totally incorrect, because the Arab states are so worried about Iran that they, on their own accord, have made major outreach efforts to Israel to improve their relations with Israel, because they view Israel as one of the world's most important powers in countering the threat of Iran to the Middle East and to them as Arab Sunni regimes. And so it is absolutely clear that the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan have all been willing to improve their relations with Israel, even in open ways, not just under the table, in order to make a strategic coalition with the Israelis against Iran, because they realize that Israel is valuable in the anti-Iran efforts. These Arab countries view Iran as a major threat to themselves, and they view Israel as valuable in two major ways. Number one, Israel is valuable militarily. Israel is attacking the Iranians and their proxies in Syria, in Lebanon, and possibly even in Iran itself. As we've seen there have been recent attacks against Iranian targets. Nobody knows at this point exactly who's responsible. It's like an Agatha Christie novel. You've got all kinds of possible candidates, the Saudis, the Americans, the Israelis. They all have good motives and means for attacking the Iranians, and there have been a lot of targets destroyed in Iran, and nobody knows who's done it. But it's possible that Israel has done it, or at least done some of it. And so Israel's ability to hit the Iranians physically is a major asset for the anti-Iran coalition throughout the Middle East. And then perhaps even more valuable, Israel's voice in the capital of the most important military power in the world, which is the United States. Israel's voice is enormously important in developing anti-Iran policies in Washington. And the Saudis understand that, and the Emiratis understand that, as do the Egyptians, the Jordanians, and others. And so I think that's a large part of the reason that the Israelis have been able to improve their relations with those countries completely without regard to the issue of where diplomacy is with the Palestinian Authority.
Right, right. And therefore, I was really honored, I have to say, to be in the White House when President Trump unveiled his plan, and sitting right in front of me were the ambassadors of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Oman, and it was unbelievable to see them there. They did not applaud, but they were there. So that was wonderful. Getting back to your time in the George W. Bush White House, can you tell us a little bit about how the Karen A. affair played out in President Bush's thinking?
Well, let's remind everybody of the timing and the context. The Karen A. was a ship that was carrying a large cargo of contraband weapons from Iran to Gaza. And the Israeli Navy captured the Karen A in January 2002. So 9/11 had occurred on September 11th, 2001. And here we are a few months later, it was around January 1st or so, that the Israelis captured the Karen A. And the Israelis had intelligence linking Arafat personally to the arrangements by which the Palestinians had bought these arms from the Iranians and were secretly shipping them to Gaza. And so when the Israelis captured this shipment, they came to Washington to brief administration officials, myself included. And there were a number of, there's a new book coming out on this by the former head of Israeli military intelligence. And he describes the briefings of the various officials. The State Department officials were in general unwilling to accept the idea that Yasser Arafat could be involved in something as nasty and dishonest as, this violation, clear-cut violation of his responsibilities under the Oslo process agreements. And so they were asking very skeptical questions and unwilling to accept the conclusion. They point out that when they came to brief me at the Pentagon, the idea that Yasser Arafat was not truthful and was still committed to terrorism was not something that I found hard to believe. And so I was much more open to the proof that the Israelis had, and they did have proof. I mean, ultimately, the whole U.S. government accepted what the Israelis presented. As soon as the Israelis captured this, there were a number of consequences for the thinking of top Bush administration officials, in particular, President Bush himself. One was the president had said in the war on terrorism, everybody has to pick sides. And he identified the big problem in the war on terrorism as the major state sponsors of terrorism. So Afghanistan was one of them, Iran, Iraq, North Korea, there were a number that he named, and the Iran, Iraq, and North Korea were, of course, the famous axis of evil that the president highlighted in his, I believe it was January 2002 State of the Union speech. So here we are just a few weeks before that, when that concept is at the fore of President Bush's mind. And here we see that Yasser Arafat, who is somebody that we are dealing with diplomatically all the time, that Colin Powell was talking to when Colin was Secretary of State, Arafat's security forces were being paid for and trained by the United States, and he is in bed with one of the world's leading state sponsors of terrorism, Iran, and a major enemy of the United States, not just of Israel, and Arafat's in bed with the Iranians. So that's point one. Point two is this shipment was in violation of the Oslo Accords. So Arafat's in bad faith with respect to those peace accords, at the same time that Colin Powell and Condi Rice are urging President Bush to try to create new peace accords with Arafat. Thirdly, when the US, having received the briefing and the intelligence from the Israelis, went to Arafat and asked him about the Karine A and what happened with it, Arafat flagrantly lied, repeatedly, which infuriated President Bush. So the idea that he was in bed with the Iranians, he was in violation of his Oslo agreements, and he was lying to us, and we knew that he was lying to us, really had a major effect on, in particular, Vice President Cheney, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, and then President Bush. And it affected the president's attitude, so that when he was getting constant pressure from Secretary of State Powell and National Security Advisor Rice to make more and more concessions in favor of Arafat to try to promote the peace process, Bush became non-receptive to that advice more and more after the Karine A. I mean, the Karine A was really described by all the officials involved as a really significant event, a turning point in President Bush's attitude toward Arafat. And I think it was an important part of the reason that in June of 2002, when the president gave his major Middle East speech, his major speech on Arab-Israeli peace, he said the Palestinians need a new leadership untainted by terrorism. And from that speech forward, there was no contact between President Bush and Arafat ever. And that basically slammed the door on all of these proposals that that Powell and Rice were making in favor of presidential peace initiatives reaching out to Arafat. And there were none until after Arafat died and Abbas came in, and then the president was willing to try it again.
Finally, you described the Obama years very well, and point out almost from the get-go from President Obama's speech in Cairo that he felt that he had to make up for the biases of the George W. Bush administration, which he perceived of as a tilt towards the Israelis and tilt towards the Palestinians. And there seems to be this kind of predictable pattern. Do you think if we are going to be facing a Biden-Harris team that they will need a Karine A moment? Do you think we're headed towards that direction of the same old pattern?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, there's a well-known phenomenon that as the old French foreign minister Talleyrand said about the Bourbon kings of France, he said they learned nothing and forgot nothing. And that quality of learning nothing and forgetting nothing is characteristic of the State Department and its Arab-Israeli peace diplomacy. And so we may find that even though there's ample historical grounds for rejecting the old conventional wisdom, we may find that it returns to power if the Democrats win the next election. I do think, though, that while it's reasonable to suppose that Biden will have views somewhat similar to Obama's on these matters, I think his personal instincts will be a little more centrist than, I mean, I think Obama was quite radical in his hostility to Israel on these peace matters. I think Biden is probably less radical in his inclinations. He's more conventional. And there has been a lot of water under the bridge, and there's a lot to be learned from the flow of that water in recent years. And it's possible that Biden and the people around him will moderate their views somewhat in light of history. And the history is fairly clear, for example, that the Israelis are able to improve their relations with the Arab states, even if there's not progress with the Palestinians on peace. And so that argument may be viewed skeptically. There is the argument that, the Arab street will explode if the United States does anything that's pro-Israel. That argument has been refuted over and over again and may be treated more skeptically even in a future Democratic administration. I mean, the fact that the sky didn't fall and the world didn't end when we moved our embassy to Jerusalem, I'm sure taught everybody a lesson, including people who had the conventional view. And so I think that there's some possibility that, and also the publication of the Trump peace plan itself is a learning opportunity. And even though this peace plan itself is, came out late in the administration, and if Trump loses, it goes away as a peace plan, it still influences people's sense of the art of the possible. And so I think that it could have ongoing intellectual influence, even though the plan itself will die. The ideas in it, I think, might have ongoing influence. I hope they will, because this plan is really one of the most interesting, creative, and I think accurate, correct analyses of the Arab-Israeli conflict and peacemaking issues that any U.S. government has published since the birth of Israel. And so it's in an administration that is not distinguished for brilliant, coherent discussion of foreign policy, it really stands out as a bright spot. And I think that, as I said, I think it contains truths and it contains some bright ideas that might, for people who have their eyes open, might actually continue to exercise some intellectual influence, even if Trump loses the election and the Democrats come in.
Wonderful. Okay. We seem to have run out of time. First of all, I'd like to apologize to our viewers that submitted questions that we did not have the opportunity to go through all of your questions. If you would like, you could send your questions to our team at info@emetonline.org, and I will forward them on to Doug. Doug, I cannot thank you enough. When we send out the video, which we do after each one of our webinars, we will again send out your monograph to all of our viewers. I cannot recommend highly enough to read Doug's monograph because we all know Santayana's adage about those who do not study history are condemned to repeat its mistakes. And this goes through the history of every plan since Oslo and what the pitfalls are. And irrespective of whether or not any of the Trump plan is going to be implemented, we could use this as a guide to avoid those pitfalls. And thank you once again for your friendship and for your brilliance and everything that you've contributed to America's security and Israel's security for so many years now, Doug. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for all of your great work with EMET. It's, you make a valuable contribution.
Okay, thank you so much. Bye-bye now.